Good morning. I hope everybody's doing well. Today we are going to cover section 2, and just as a review, I want to pull up the Canvas course and just check into where we are at in the semester. Let me go ahead and share that with you. And here's our Canvas course, federal regulations, and we've been working on the discussions. I've been very impressed. I've really enjoyed the discussion posts that you've all contributed to. I hope you're enjoying them as well. I've tried to incorporate a lot of things that are relevant and things that you may not have thought about in terms of things that are actually happening in the news and that relate to radiation therapy or radioactive materials or x-rays, but things in the news that are actually happening. So I hope you've been enjoying those. I've certainly enjoyed your contributions to those discussions. So this last weekend, you turned in the first section of objectives, and I will be grading those in the next week or so I can get your feedback on those. This week, we're starting section 2. There's a discussion for dirty bomb threats. It's pretty interesting. And then the week after that, there's one on the VA policy for vet exposure. And then week 9, that's spring break, so you have you can work on the objectives if you'd like to, but you don't have anything due that week. And then March 21st is when those section 2 objectives are due. And then we'll have class and we'll go on from there. Do we have any questions about the discussions or about the objectives or anything that we've covered so far in the class? All right. Well, without further ado, let's get the lecture for section 2 up. And we'll go ahead and get started with that. Okay, so for the NCRP stands for National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements. And so they have a history of providing guidelines in terms of radiation protection, and they disseminate a lot of information and research that's been conducted in terms of radiation and the effects and guidelines for protecting workers, people, the environment, and the public. So they also have this document, which is really interesting. I'll pull that up in just a second, that describes a lot of the history of radiation and the forms of radiation protection from when x-rays were first discovered and how that's evolved over time as we've learned more about radiation, how it works, and also as we've improved our equipment and how we're producing radiation and how that has changed a lot of those aspects as well. So I do want to pull this up real quick, and I'm going to have to stop my share so we can look at it. Okay, so here we are. This is the Radiation Safety Journal. This basically has a history of U.S. radiation protection regulations, recommendations, and standards. So this is certainly not a requirement, but you're more than welcome to go read this. This is very interesting information. So it'll provide you with information about when x-rays were first discovered, and they didn't realize the effects of radiation. It talks about Thomas Edison, how he was working with fluoroscopy, and his assistant was the first victim of working with radiation. Early recommendations that they had in terms of x-rays and radium and what they thought was the high doses. And then it goes into how we started to develop radiation protection recommendations once we knew that there were negative effects to radiation. And then it goes through, we have the ICRP, that's the International Council on Radiation Protection, how Congress got interested in helping with the NCRP, Radiation Council, the EPA. Then we got more, basically now, we're in that 1974 to present. This is the new regulatory era, so we do have different regulations than when x-rays were first discovered and when radiation was first discovered. So now we have the Department of Education, the NRC, the ICRP, and we have the, ALARA principle, and then it has a lot of things listed out here. So this is just some really awesome information if you would like to. Again, it's not required that you read through this, but I would highly recommend it. It'll give you a good overview of radiation protection and where we've come from and where we are now. Okay. Let me get my PowerPoint pulled back up. Okay. So the NCRP, also they provide information to the NRC. This is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so the NRC has the power to actually have requirements. So we have several components. So this is part of what you'll be going through as you go through your objectives for this section. So a lot of times you can just simply Google NRC 10 CFR 29 and then in parentheses 20. And this will take you to the NRC website and it'll have all this information. But this is specifically regarding radiation protection. So it has several subparts as you see listed here. So A does general provisions, kind of talks about, okay, what's the purpose of this document? What's the scope? A lot of the definitions that are used. So as you go throughout the document, if you see a word or a term that you're not sure of or what they are talking about or how they are defining it, then you can go up to that first part and look at the definitions. Talks about the dose measurements as well. In subpart B, this discusses radiation protection programs. So how are they developed? How do we document what's being done in these programs? And how do you implement these programs, maybe in a new facility? This is something that does need to be reviewed annually. So that is a requirement by the NRC. They have to review the radiation protection program content and implementation on an annual basis. Subpart C is where you find the occupational dose limits. So this is where the NRC has those dose limits stated, what they should be for occupational workers, what they should be for the public, and so on and so forth. So that's what D is there for the members of the public. E discusses criteria for terminating a license. So what things would need to be done to lose your license. And this is license for individual, but also for a facility that produces radiation. If they're not following radiation protection program requirements and not following the regulations as set by the NRC, they could lose their license to offer that service. Subpart F talks about surveys and monitoring and how that is conducted or should be conducted. G is control of exposure from external sources in restricted areas. H, this is respiratory protection and controls to restrict exposure in restricted areas. I is the storage and control of licensed material. So how does it stored? How is it controlled? How is it managed? J is precautionary procedures. So these are the posting requirements when you're, and like the lighted signs when you're making an exposure to indicate to someone outside the room that they should not enter because an exposure is being made. Posting requirements, labeling of radioactive materials and containers, all of that fits into the subpart J. Subpart K discusses waste disposal. So particularly what we're interested in is radiation, radioactive materials. How do we dispose of them safely? Subpart L deals with records, how we maintain records. M is how we report information. N is exemptions and additional requirements for facilities. And O is how it is enforced. So again, NRC has the ability to have these requirements and actually enforce them. So that if there's a violation, there can be criminal penalties associated with violating these policies. And that's different from the NCRP because the NCRP, they look at research and they provide recommendations, but the NRC is what has the power to enforce and have these penalties associated with violations. Next, we have pregnancy. So there must be a pregnancy policy for every radiation department for any worker that may become pregnant. So what is needed? There needs to be some method. Now, the pregnant worker is not required to declare their pregnancy. But if they do, then that makes the facility, the employer, responsible for providing them with that fetal dosimeter and making sure that they don't exceed the limits for the pregnancy and for the monthly fetus exposure. So when this is done, if the worker chooses to do this, again, it's voluntary, but if they choose to declare their pregnancy, then it does have to be signed in writing. And at that point, the employer is responsible. They must provide specific training and information to the pregnant worker to advise them on how to protect their fetus during the pregnancy. And then they'll assign that film badge specifically for that fetal exposure. If the radiation worker is working with radioactive materials, then it may be required to get bioassay samples and counts, such as urinalysis or thyroid. If they're specifically working with radiation, radioactivity, then that is something that may be required as well. Now, I have the 3 different organizations listed here. So you can see that the NRC requires, they have the ability to require, but the ICRP and the NCRP, these are the recommendations. But the Regulatory Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has the power to actually enforce. So this is in NRC 10 CFR 20. CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations. So they require for the entire pregnancy that the dose cannot exceed 500 millirems, which is 5 millisieverts. And you'll see that they use these pretty often. They'll still use like the traditional units in a lot of these documents. They may use both, they may use one or the other. So just make sure that you are familiar with converting between the traditional and the SI units. For the monthly, it's no more than 50 millirems or 0.5 millisieverts. And then you'll see that the NCRP had the same recommendation. So the NRC requires what the NCRP recommended. So those measurement doses, these maximum amounts of radiation are the same. However, it is pretty interesting to look at the ICRP. So this is the International Commission, and they actually recommend that the entire pregnancy be no more than 200 millirems or 2 millisieverts. So that's a significantly lower recommendation than what the NCRP and the NRC are saying. That's just something to keep in mind. There are some differences. Again, the national, this is specifically for the US. International, that's a recommendation on an international scope. Some other recommendations when a pregnant worker declares their pregnancy, they are recommended that they can use the double lead to protect themselves from scatter radiation. They may be able to reduce fluoro and OR procedures. However, they are not exempt from doing their job. So that's something that some employers will be a little more accommodating, but they're not required to. You shouldn't be unable to perform your job as long as you are following all the safety procedures. So, double lead, reducing as much time in fluoro and OR as you can, and making sure that you have that fetal dosimeter and are not exceeding these limits. In terms of exposure records, so this is CFR Part 19 and 20 in the Code of Federal Regulations 10. And this requires that any individual that's working with radiation that is likely to receive a radiation dose of over 100 millirems in a year, or basically like 10% of the maximum radiation dose, then they are required, the employer is required to provide those employees with radiation dosimeters. And a lot of these dosimeters are either collected on a monthly or a quarterly basis. And once they are submitted, they have to be reported within 30 days so that you have the records of how much radiation dose you got during that time period. And you'll have your dose for that time period, but it will also have a cumulative dose. So it has your lifetime dose. This is something that is retained forever. It follows you. So even if you end up going to work at another facility, that record follows you because you have to have your lifetime dose. So it'll have your history. You can actually request
employers that are providing these dosimeters, they should be reported to the Radiation Exposure Information and Reporting System, the REIRS. And this is the link if you wanted to go in there and request your records. That's something that you can do. But if you are not familiar with reading your dosimetry report, here's a little guide that explains the different aspects of your dosimetry report. But this is something that as a radiation worker, you should be familiar with, you should be watching, and you should be paying attention to how much radiation dose you're getting. This is something that radiation safety officers will look at and evaluate, hey, we're noticing that this one person is getting a lot more radiation dose than the rest. What's the reason? Why is this happening? And this can help to identify certain patterns that can help implement policies or even just change some habits that can reduce exposure to individuals or to the department as a whole. Here we have the Radiation Safety Committee program. So every facility should have a radiation safety officer. That's what the RSO is. They're also part of a radiation safety committee. So there's a whole group of people that are in charge of looking at the records, helping with this radiation safety program, implementation, documentation, and reporting. So this includes administrators, often technologists or a lead technologist. The radiation safety officer could be a lead technologist or it could be a radiologist, but a combination of people within that hospital and within the radiology department are a part of this committee program. Again, we have the records that are really important. So this includes the radiation safety or the radiation dosimeter reports and following those, watching those, keeping track of any abnormalities or any extenuously high doses. Then they also are required to provide training. So this is something that is often part of new employee training. When you first get to a facility, they'll have the recommendations for how to keep yourself safe, but also continuing education for current employees, those that have been working at the facility, and how to continue safe practices. This is also very important when we get new equipment that maybe workers are not used to working with, and providing that education on how to protect themselves and keeping them safe using new equipment. Also, they should have a plan. This program should have a policy for how to report an incident if there is an incident, and how to report that and address it and take care of it. So the radiation safety officer has several duties. They identify safety problems in regards to radiation. Then they can initiate, recommend, or provide corrective actions based off of safety problems that they have identified and things that they are noticing. They can also stop unsafe operations. So perhaps maybe people are not using this new machine correctly, and so they will stop this unsafe operation and maybe provide some additional training and talk about how to use it safely and to help workers to continue in a safe manner moving forward. Then they have to verify the implementation of the corrective actions. So they can't just say, hey, you need to be better at this, wear your shield or make sure you're getting at least 6 feet away when you're using the portable machine, and then not think about it again. They have to make sure that the employees are actually using those corrective actions and are following the guidance or recommendations that you have, or that the radiation safety officer has implemented. And then they also must retain record of actions that have been taken. So I do want to show you this document. When I pull up documents with Zoom, I have to stop the share and then re-share it right here. Okay, so this is just the NRC 10 Code of Federal Regulations 35, so medical use of byproduct material. And I just provided this as a link. This should help you with some of your objectives for this section, but you can see that there's a lot of information here, how to, use material, brachytherapy, photon emission, records, and reports and enforcement. So this has a lot of information based off of some
of the objectives that you may be working through in this section. Do we have any questions so far? Okay. So we also have recommendations and requirements for fluoroscopy and mobile equipment. This is in 42 CFR 37.43 and the NCRP report 33. So this deals with the imaging equipment itself, compression release safety, dosage, reproducibility, detail and resolution, and collimation. So this is specifically the fluoroscopy and mobile equipment. You know, is it producing the dose that it actually says it is? Is it reproducible? What's the quality? Is it diagnostic? Do we have good resolution? And are the collimators working properly to be a form of radiation protection? Another great resource I've indicated right here. So you can go and look here. This may provide some great information. Let's pull that up briefly and take a look at that. So this is a PowerPoint presentation from the NCRP. So this talks about several things. This is a really great resource, Radium Protection Committee, Atomic Energy Commission, NCRP reports. So I recommend looking at this, especially if you are having a hard time with some of the objectives. This should provide you with a lot of great information. Okay. Now we're skipping back and forth a lot. All right. So with the fluoroscopy and mobile equipment, with imaging equipment, these are some of the requirements that are in place. So the image intensifier has to have 2 millimeters of lead, and that helps to reduce leakage radiation, radiation coming off to help protect the patient and those in the room. There's also a minimum source to skin distance, the SSD, and that's 15 inches or 38 centimeters. For mobile equipment, it's 12 inches or 30 centimeters. So there is a slight difference between the source to skin distance for fluoroscopy versus mobile equipment. With the fluoroscopy and C-arms, there has to be a cumulative 5-minute timer. That is a requirement. And that has to be an audible sound. So once you hit 5 minutes of fluoro time, it should produce a beep or an audible signal saying that, hey, you've got 5 minutes of fluoro time. As a technologist, it is our responsibility to declare, hey, it's been 5 minutes of fluoro time, so that the radiologist or the surgeon or whoever is working on that case is aware, and then they are made aware of how much dose has been given during that time frame. You've probably experienced being in a room with, it doesn't happen as often with radiologists because they're more aware of radiation, but surgeons in procedures, sometimes they forget, they kind of are foot heavy and they keep their foot on the pedal for a little bit longer than maybe is necessary. And so just that reminder can often say, oh yeah, I need to back off the radiation a little bit and just use it as necessary. There's a maximum tube output requirement. So maximum is 10 rads per minute. And then the high dose rate is 20 rads per minute. So that's double rads per minute. And that's why we don't want to use the high dose for the entire study. We only use it when it's absolutely necessary. The total filtration requirement is 2.5 millimeters aluminum equivalent. And the protective curtain is 0.25 millimeters of lead equivalent. And I like these images. This shows you what the exit dose versus the entrance dose. Remember that with fluoroscopy, the X-ray tube is in the table, it's underneath the patient, and then it shoots up to the image intensifier. And this particularly shows the radiation that can be received if you're standing right next to the patient.
So this is 1 foot, 2 foot, and 3 feet away. You can see that if you're right next to the patient, there is a significantly high amount of radiation. So that's 500 millirads per hour if you're right in this close region to the patient, which is usually where the radiologist or the PA is working because they're working on the patient. They're doing something with the patient. And as technologists are often close to this area because we're moving the tower back and forth based off of what we're doing. And then you'll see as you get a little farther away, this region right here is 100 millirads per hour. And then as you get to that kind of 3 foot range, it's 50 millirads per hour. That's still a lot of radiation dose. And then you see when you use the radiation, this lead curtain, that reduces it significantly. So that's 5 millirads per hour. That's a ton of radiation dose reduction. And that's only at 1 foot. So that just goes to show how important it is to use that protective curtain whenever possible, because it reduces the dose significantly to those that are in the room helping with this procedure. Now, this is moving into deceased patients. So deceased patients that have radioactive implants or therapeutic dosage of radiation materials, there's a lot of recommendations and requirements for what must be done. In a lot of cases, they'll term it tag and bag, where they have to document how much radiation this patient is radioactive because they have these implants or therapeutic dosages within them. They have to tag it, and then they'll bag the patient up and help take care of the deceased. In regards to this, if the deceased contains a temporary implant, so for example, after loaded sealed radioactive sources, the radiation oncologist should go and remove those radioactive sources and survey the body prior to transferring them to the hospital morgue. If they have permanently implanted sealed sources, they must record indicating the implanted radionuclide, the date, the quantity of the implant, and the area of the implant, and it must be attached to the body prior to transferring to the hospital morgue. And then you must notify the hospital morgue prior to transferring the body that they have radioactive sealed sources so that they can be protected from, working with that deceased patient and be aware of what precautions they need to take before they receive that patient. It shouldn't be a surprise, oh, this patient's radioactive. They should be made aware before they are working with them. I have some sources here. So these are some very interesting sources I recommend taking a look at as well. The CDC, one actually has a lot of different scenarios, scenarios that we hope we would never have to encounter, because, for example, some of them are the detonation of a nuclear weapon or some kind of a terrorist type of attack that deals with nuclear materials. It also discusses how to check bodies for contamination in these types of scenarios. So we have the high-range Geiger-Muller counters. The Geiger-Muller probe works with gamma only. And then we have the low-range Geiger-Muller pancake probe that deals with alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. Okay, so as I said before, the term tag and bag. So the tag indicates dose rate from the deceased and the distance from which it was measured. So how far away were they when they measured this dose, the dose rate. With these patients, you usually want to encourage family members and friends to minimize time standing close to or next to the deceased. It's also recommended that they bury them immediately rather than embalming them, because that reduces the dose to those that have to work with and prepare the body for the embalmment. However, this can be very, very difficult for some people, especially if there are emotional, cultural, and religious reasons. So again, that's why this has remained a recommendation, not a requirement necessarily, but it is a recommendation to help reduce dose to those that may have to work with the body if embalming is the option of choice. With these patients, cremation is not recommended. And then if they do have the brachytherapy seeds, as you can see in this image here, those must be surgically removed before cremation. It is also recommended that they do a metal casket versus a wood casket. because the metal casket actually helps to contain some of that radioactive material, and it delays that radioactive release to the environment. So a lot of these things, it's not only radiation safety for the patient, but also for workers, people that may be working with the body, to family members, to the general public, and to the environment. So those are all things to keep in mind. Now I've got a little video here on this next slide. And this is from the Chernobyl show that I believe it came out last year. And it provides some insight onto, patients. So in this scenario, Chernobyl, there was the radioactive explosion. And so people were exposed to high amounts of radiation. They were radioactive. And so we'll watch this short clip. All right, so what are some things that you noticed there in that clip?
Well, they were all put in like metal coffins and then the concrete poured over them.
Yeah. Yeah, so they had the wooden coffin, and then they put those in the metal coffins, which were likely lined with some lead, I would imagine. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, they used the concrete. So concrete is known to also help reduce that exposure to the environment. Now, that's definitely an extreme example because of how much radioactivity there was and how much they were exposed to. So again, that's an extreme example, but I think it does highlight some of the things that we've discussed in terms of a patient that's radioactive or has an implant, and some of the ways that we take care of that when taking care of the deceased. All right, moving forward into radiation therapy. Information on this is found in the NCRP report number 102. Specifically works with the equipment design and use aspects of imaging and therapy systems. Now, I know that when you're going through the objectives, there are some references to the NCRP reports. Those, you don't have to, when you try to access them, it makes you pay for them. You don't have to do that. Usually you can find the information associated with that report. We are working to actually purchase them in the department so that we can provide them as a resource to you, but that's not the case quite yet. So just kind of keep that in mind with these NCRP reports. Sometimes they're hard to get a hold of, but you can usually find information that discusses what's outlined in these reports. With radiation therapy, there are specific requirements for facility designs. So this is for the medical and physical well-being of the patient. So trying to make it an environment that is ideal for patient care, but also providing protection for the patient, staff, visitors, and any other members of the public. So the design is usually in a way that allows patients to enter and to be provided with as much comfort as possible during those procedures, but it's also not readily available to the public, so someone couldn't just walk in and be exposed to these high doses of radiation that we use in radiation therapy. So again, this is the geographical and functional integration of different activities that are used to treat the patient. And so if you're in radiation therapy, you're probably familiar with a lot of these designs and just how the facility is designed in a way to provide not only comfort and a good environment for the patient, but also protection. For external beam therapy, there does have to be an audible signal, so it has to be something that we can hear when the beam is on, because with radiation, just as a reminder, we cannot sense it. So we cannot hear it, we cannot see it, we cannot smell it or taste it or feel it. So the audible signal helps us to understand and be able to have some kind of a way to know that the beam is on. There's also requirements for the laser centering, the ISO centering. There's a lot of quality control that is done on the machine to make sure that where the laser is centering is actually where you're centering, that it's accurate. There's also requirements for the computer dose control and documentation. Again, if you're in radiation therapy, you're familiar with how to document these doses and how it's the doses are reported. There's also requirements if you're working with lasers for eye protection to protect you and your eyes from the lasers that you may be working with. Patient viewing and movement detection and dose emergency off. So there are requirements for that and how to do an emergency off button. There's also requirements for mechanical and electrical safety interlocks on the doors. And then also the two-way communication between patient and staff. So there should be a way for the patient to signal and talk to the staff and vice versa, so that there is that communication without the staff necessarily having to be in the room with the patient when the beam is on. Safety precautions when using radionuclides. This is in the NCRP report number 37. So with radiation therapy doses, we have internal and external dosage requirements. So with external, this is cobalt-60, 1.1 and 2.2 MeV for gamma therapy. And there's massive shielding that's required. So these are physical shields that are similar to the LINAC type. So this is high energy X-ray therapy equipment that we're talking about here. There's also requirements for the proper disposal of long-lived nuclides. So usually it's like a 5.5 or 5.3 year half-life. And so just knowing how long it's going to take for that to break down before it's no longer radioactive. For internal, we have the P32 or I-131. So this is therapy dose that's given to the patient. So the patient is actually radioactive. It's an internal source. So in these cases, there are specific requirements for the patient interacting with family, particularly pregnant women or young children. So for example, if they've had those brachytherapy seeds implanted, then it's usually recommended that they don't hold young children in their lap for a certain amount of time. They often have instructions to use a separate toilet because they're radioactive for a certain amount of time, and so on and so forth. For those of you, there are some radiation therapy students in here. So do you guys have any insight that you'd like to add to these doses, these requirements that you've seen maybe? Or nuclear medicine?
Hi, Taylor, it's Chris. I'm in nuke med, not radiation therapy, but we do I-131 doses, and we have the patients isolated for a few hours at our clinic before we release them. They have to get below a certain level, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten what it is. They have to get below a certain level before we release them, and then we have them kind of isolate from their family for the next 24 hours after that. So we do keep them separated for quite a while.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm sure, are you using the Geiger-Muller counters to check where they're at?
We use the dose wells to check the dose before we give it to them, and then we check them with the Geiger-Muller before we release them. But then we just base it on time after that. We don't check them at the end of the 24 hours.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, that's great insight. So it's pretty similar. Again, it may vary slightly from facility to facility, but yeah, usually there are those recommendations to kind of isolate from family for that certain amount of time to make sure that they, have time for those half-lives to break down so that they are not radioactive and not as much of a threat to others. Does anyone else have any comments they'd like to add? All right. Moving into mammo then. So with mammo, you do have to have an RT license. Mammography is considered to be a post-primary certification. So you have to have your RT first, and then you can go into mammo. With mammo, they have quality standards. And this was an FDA regulation. So it's called the Mammography Quality Standards Act, the MQSA. So again, this is regulated by the federal government. So they require 16 hours of structured education, 1 credit hour in each content category that you would go through on the mammography exam. They have to perform 25 supervised exams. This is an MQSA requirement. And then they have to do an additional 25 repetitions for clinical experience requirements. And they can be used with any mammography modality. And then there's also QC requirements. These are requirements for the actual machine. With mammography, the machine, it has a lot of detail, really, really good resolution on these images, but they have a lot of QC that has to be met in order to make sure that it upholds that high quality of images. They also are required to observe, assist with, or participate in at least 4 of the following procedures listed here. So this could include needle localization, breast MRI, breast ultrasound, which could include just imaging or a biopsy, FNA, or a cyst aspiration. So those are all used with breast ultrasound. A stereotactic procedure, ductography, galactography, tissue marker clip placement, a diagnostic mammogram, and or a recall from a screening mammogram. So those are all things they have to do at least 4 of those procedures. And then each biennium, they have 15 hours of continuing education that's specific to mammography. Again, so this is not just required through ARRT, but also by the FDA. So that's a federal regulation. All right, so that covers what we will be going over specifically in the objectives and the discussions for section 2. Any questions? All right, well, just to reiterate what I said earlier, I've been very impressed with the discussion boards and all of your contributions. Please keep that up and continue. I hope you've enjoyed them as well. And then as a reminder, by this weekend, we have that discussion on the dirty bomb threats. Next week is a discussion on the VA policy vet exposure. And then the following week is spring break. And then the objectives for section 2 are due the week after that. And then we will go from there. All right, well, thanks to everyone for being here today. If you have any other questions, feel free to let me know. And I hope you have a wonderful day.